Good morning. Can everybody hear me? Good. It is indeed my pleasure to start this first panel. I'm joined by a leadership group from the Executive Committee of the Principles. I'm going to start by introducing from the far right Angela Brusas, who's the Director, Funding and Investor Relations from the Nordic Investment Bank, and member of the Executive Committee of the Principles, followed by Isabelle Laurent, who is the Deputy Treasurer at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and is the Chair of the Executive Committee of the Principles. And on my near right, Agnes Gourc, who's Head Sustainable Capital Markets, BNP Paribas, and Vice Chair of the Executive Committee of the Principles. So please join me in welcoming them. I am going to now provide you first with an update on the recent announcements, the 2023 announcements of the Principles, and then we'll get into some of the key points, have a discussion, hopefully lively and interactive. And then we have room at 10 minutes for Q&A, so there will be roving microphones. Don't hesitate, please, to intervene. We'll also have online questions. So let's see if the technology works. If I could have my first slide. Very good. So here is an overview of the guidance that we have for you this year. It's important, before going into the details, to understand that the principles now are referenced very often in relation to ICMA, but the work that we do with this guidance is based on an outreach and participation over 400 organizations globally, all participants in the market, wider stakeholders. This goes through a number of working groups, and then this is then coordinated and decided by the Executive Committee, which is an elected group every year, representing 24 members of the market, equally issuers, investors, and underwriters. So it's not just a group of people at ICMA in a room that are coming up with this stuff. There's a very elaborate and well-governed process. So now coming to what we have in store for you today, and to some extent it follows from the priorities that Minister Andrani shared with us, because we start this year with an update of the Climate Transition Finance Handbook. This is a guidance that we had provided in 2020. I would argue that we were ahead of our time, because it focuses on what issuers need to do at an organization level. It focuses on strategy in particular. And this year what we do is we provide, one, a general update, two, much more granularity in terms of how you can finance the transition with sustainable bonds, whether they're use of proceeds bonds or whether they're SLBs. And also we reference very explicitly official sector guidance, including the Singapore taxonomy, which has just come out very importantly and is indeed one of the first ones which integrates transition. Now, we also, and this is our second key deliverable, have updated the sustainability-linked bond principles. This is the product which allows investors to look at the trajectory of the issuers. And one of the key developments in the last 12 months has been sovereigns entering into this market. So we have updated this guidance for sovereigns explicitly. It didn't require too much adaptation, but it was important to think about it. And that adaptation goes all the way to the KPI registry, which accompanies the SLBP. Now, in addition to this, we have additional Q&As on sustainable bond securitization. We have revised language of the social bond principles, new core recommendations for impact reporting, references to just transition in the handbook, in the Climate Transition Finance Handbook, but also in other documents. And finally, we have revised mapping to the SDGs. So that's a quick overview. Next slide. Maybe I have to push the button. There we are. Here is just a different way of looking at what I just summarized for you. In this visualization, what's interesting is also to have an idea of the overall guidance we provide with the principles. There's the product level, which is the first row, which is the product standards for the different types of sustainable bonds. In green, you can see what we've updated. The second level, we have the thematic and reporting guidance, and that's where you'll find our Climate Transition Finance Handbook, which applies across the board. And then there's the other guidance that we provide, and that includes, for example, external reviewer guidance, very important, and impact reporting that I've just mentioned. So this is just a different way of looking at it, and it's an infographic which we try to make available widely. Now, the next slide, I'm coming back to this Climate Transition Finance Handbook. We spend a lot of time on this infographic because this is where we try to bring it all together in a summary way. And I say this because the handbook isn't necessarily easy reading. It's not something that you're going to take to bed. So, if you want to know very quickly what it's about, here is an infographic which hopefully, again, will be widely circulated in the market. So at the beginning, we have a few bullet points in this graphic where we reaffirm the importance of aligning with the guidance at the issuer level. We refer to the fact that you can finance through different types of bonds, including through ones that may be sub-labeled as climate transition bonds. We emphasize the importance of disclosures underpinning this. Now, the second row is the key elements of the Climate Transition Finance Handbook. And here we cover the 4 core components of the handbook. And so very quickly, what those cover is firstly the importance of having at the issuer level a transition strategy and related governance. The second key part of it is to have explain the materiality of the strategy to your overall business. Then, of course, to reaffirm that your strategy is science-based. And finally, provide transparency on the implementation, particularly in relation to CapEx. So that gives you a quick overview of what we've done there. And that allows me to make the transition now to the panel, because I'm going to start with Isabelle. And Isabelle, I'm going to ask you if you can go into a bit more detail on what we've done in climate transition finance.
Thank you. I don't know if everybody can hear all right. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be in Singapore again, so especially after the pandemic. So it feels like we've been away for too long. So we've had a pretty productive year, and I think the update of the transition handbook has been especially important this year. I think, as the Minister mentioned in her speech, the importance of transition instruments is particularly important if we're to really achieve the Paris objectives. And a lot of the green bond market had hitherto been focused on instruments that were near zero or net zero instruments. So really, when it came out in 2020, it was really with the acceptance that we need to see more from the hard-to-abate sector. And what the transition handbook really looks at is trying to clarify what issuer-led practices, actions, and disclosures are needed for credible issuance of use of proceeds bonds, and in particular green bonds and sustainability bonds, as well as sustainability-linked instruments. So from that, we can see that highlighting the relevance of making a meaningful contribution to an issuer's GHG reduction strategy is important, whether we're talking about use of proceeds bonds or we're talking about sustainability-linked instruments. And for sustainability-linked instruments, it's particularly focusing on those that use one or more KPIs that are focused on GHG reductions. So metrics such as absolute intensity reduction. This year, it's been made more usable in the handbook. There's been a focus on very specific recommendations over and above the ones that have previously been made. So looking at things like independent oversight by a board member or independent board members of transition plans and climate strategy. So the level of importance given in an organization to credible decarbonization. It also focuses on recommendations to do with the materiality of disclosures, which is another important aspect of trying to ensure that things are all moving in the right direction, whether they're use of proceeds or they're about the issuer's overall decarbonisation strategy. What matters is having credible projects that are consistent with an overall strategy in relation to use of proceeds bonds. Focuses on disclosures that are very specific, like the proportion of capex related to green investments and the ratio of those to the total capex investments has been important. We've got two annexes that I think are extremely helpful in this. One is illustrative examples of disclosures for each stage. That should be helpful, whether issuing use of proceeds bonds that have a transition theme or sustainability-linked bonds that are focused on this transition theme. And then there is, as mentioned by Nicholas, this annex with, with specific official and market sector guidance. It's a non-exhaustive list, but it not only includes the Singapore taxonomy, but others from the region, such as from Malaysia, Japan, and South Korea, and the ASEAN taxonomy. So I think there is a lot of meat and reference that we can have so that it's joined up. But the green bond principles and then all subsequent other principles have always focused on not saying precisely what is green or green enough. It is focused on the level of transparency that is required in order to, for investors and others to assess whether or not it is sufficiently credible. And I think these, the handbook itself has been very helpful in making the clarification there so that if following that handbook, it should be possible to establish the credibility of the transition irrespective of the instruments that are being issued. And I think on that note, I will hand over to Agnes, who can talk about the sustainability-linked bond principles and the changes that have been made this year.
Thank you, Isabelle, and good morning, everyone. Very happy to be with you in Singapore. So on the SLB, the working group has been very busy again this year, and rightly so, given the take-up of the instrument. And the way it relates to the Climate Transition Finance Handbook, it is true SLB have been an instrument that are very well adapted, not only, but in particular for hard-to-abate sectors. So the working group has been focused on really 3 bodies of work when it comes to SLB, looking at the principles, as Nicola mentioned, with the incorporation of the sovereign elements, looking at the KPI registry, and a part on the Q&A that I'll briefly mention. So when it came to the principles, we reviewed effectively the way it is today, and it was decided that it didn't need a complete overhaul, but definitely needed a few adaptations to incorporate sovereign issues that were new entrants effectively to the SLB market. And if you recall, when we drafted the principles, it was really back in June 2020, it was really following the first SLB issued by NL, so corporate. And it was very much drafted with corporates in mind, so even the semantic was orientated towards corporate specifically. So you will see in the principles a few really kind of, obvious changes, such as we were referring to sustainability strategy, we now refer to sustainability strategy and sustainability policies, so it's really adapted to sovereigns. And the only part where we felt that really a specific treatment was needed for sovereigns, and it was widely discussed at the working group level and back at the EXCOM, is if you look in the 4th segment, which talks about reporting, where the principle asks for an annual reporting on the KPI, at least up until and at the maturity, at the test date. And for the sovereigns, obviously, especially when it comes to GHG emission reporting at country level, doing that on an annual basis is sometimes practically infeasible. So the way we treated it is really to look at adding qualitative information as to the relative evolution of the performance on that KPI for sovereigns specifically, where it's impractical to report annually. So not a massive change, but really to acknowledge the sovereign issuances that we've seen in the market, first from Chile and then from Uruguay, and really welcoming further issuances effectively in the market. So the next step was to further adapt the KPI registry. Again, limited changes, so you will see that the whole basis of the principle is to make changes when they are needed and not to over-complexify the matter. So the two areas that you will see have changed is a dedicated section for KPIs for sovereigns. And here the working group decided to use a slightly different approach. The whole basis of the KPI registry when it was originally set up was to provide suggestions for the market in respect of really what are the most relevant KPIs for a given sector. And the approach at the time was to say, let's define some core KPI that can stand by themselves in an SLB, and then a set of secondary KPI that won't stand by themselves and need to be either added with further secondary KPI or added to a core KPI. And when it came to sovereign, the working group and at the ExCom level, it was quite clear that we needed to be to treat that a bit differently, and in particular that each sovereign would have very specific regional differences and would really look at some KPI as core or not, depending on the geography. So this core versus secondary is not there in the sovereign part for the KPI registry. And then there is a new section on social KPIs. So if you've opened that registry, you will have seen that they were all about environmental KPI, and so we started adding some social KPIs. They cover specific themes so far: access and affordability, just transition, third one, which I've forgotten about, the value chain. And the idea will have further elaboration, of course, over the years. So that's a very helpful tool, obviously available on the ICMA registry to give some suggestions on the KPI to be selected for an SLB. And finally, on the Q&A topic. So Q&A is a very broad topic, given you will have seen that across the type of instruments, we have dedicated Q&As. And there are a lot of parties in the ExCom and the working groups involved in developing that. And it really highlights, I think, once again, the point of the principles, which are market-based initiative. And of course, you know, every feedback from every market participants, every observer is welcome, because we need to further improve constantly. In reality, that's the beauty of the market, that, you know, it's all public and we take feedback and keep improving. And that's what the SLB working group have done as well. And so there'll be, it's kind of, you know, still under progress and being finalized, and there'll be further Q&A across actually instruments, and in particular on SLB as well. So you can look forward to more after this conference. So I think I'll pause there.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, I have actually maybe two follow-on questions to this. So maybe firstly, for Isabelle, just coming back on climate transition. You know, there is this different development around you know, transition-themed bonds internationally, and I was wondering if you wanted to comment on you know, on the topic of labeling bond on, you know, either transition climate finance or climate transition themes, transition bonds. What are we saying about that?
So in relation to transition-themed bonds, the general view which was taken by the Climate Transition Working Group back in 2019-20 at the time of establishing the first handbook, and which was reaffirmed this year, was the idea that anything that looks at a substantial, credible decarbonization is effectively green, But when you're talking about the hard-to-abate sector, the real importance is to establish that there's no lock-in. So this is the aspect of why we consider them to be a sub-label, an additional label under green bonds and sustainability bonds or sustainability-linked bonds, rather than an absolute separate category. And I think in different jurisdictions, they may take a different view, but with all the concerns around greenwashing, the general perspective of needing to establish both the relevance of the projects to substantial decarbonization and the way that they're consistent with an overarching strategy, environmental strategy, are the absolute core of a use of proceeds bond. And in relation to sustainability-linked bonds, the overarching strategy is obviously hugely relevant, especially in relation to the hard-to-abate sector. So once you've established that, it's very difficult then to establish at what point are you talking about something other than a green bond. And therefore, that's why we've seen it as a sub-label or an additional label, and indeed actually preceding the original Climate Transition Finance Handbook, EBRD itself decided to issue green transition bonds and made clear that these were under the green bond principles for exactly that reason. We saw that the important aspect was that was different than looking at the near zero or net zero projects that we had under our original green bonds, was just the focus on the overarching strategy, which has to be credible, even if there's not an absolute path at this point to net zero for the sector. So that's why referencing, as the Climate Transition Handbook focuses on, the different sectoral pathways is extremely important, ensuring that there's no lock-in. And at that point, there is no difference between the two. And I think with all the concerns around greenwashing, trying to carve out something that's different becomes very difficult. So it's really establishing the credibility of both aspects, the relevance of projects and the overarching strategy.
So as long as it's credible, you can do a use of proceeds, climate bond, green transition bond, and you can do the same thing with an SLB, but the key thing is to have the credibility and avoid the lock-in. Okay. Let us...
Can I add something? Because
please.
Just on it, I think probably what, if we look into the future and where there'll be potentially more of kind of, transition bond labeled transaction, I think it relates back to what the Minister was saying earlier is, and that's where the official sector can play a different role potentially from the principles, is if you have a taxonomy that will define what market consensus, science-based will be on transition projects, that will be very helpful when it comes to credibility, effectively, of the instruments.
So when in doubt, you can default back to official sector guidance, and as it progresses and integrates transition, that's what the market can rely on. Okay, Isabelle, you've been mentioning greenwashing, and we're going to have a whole panel on greenwashing and a whole panel on transition later on, so we're not going to cover all of this now. But one of the areas where there's been criticism is around SLBs, and the criticism is focused in particular on ambition, and we put a lot of work into that. But I wonder if you would like to comment, maybe starting with Agnes, on where we are with SLBs.
Yeah. So I think what is really helpful, and that's why we're referring to the sovereigns, is that already having new market player entering the market does show effectively the way forward in terms of evolution, and that this instrument has a lot of use cases, even well beyond corporates. When it comes to credibility, obviously that has been always what the ExCom and the working group have had in mind when it comes to SLB, and that's why all the work I was describing earlier has been carried out. So for example, the KPI registry has been, and it's been actually, if we talk very openly, it's been a bit of a departure from the principles actually approach, which was always to remain very neutral on what you should consider when we had only use proceeds bonds as a green project or a social project. So actually, when it comes to SLB, we've already gone one step forward in terms of making suggestions on KPI. Again, that distinction of core versus secondary was very key, and really kind of, we have to recognize the extensive work that has been done by the working group and the coordinators there. And so there is a lot actually at the disposal of the market. It's all about how do we take those theoretical, effectively, cases in practice, and where, at least as kind of, rangers at BNP Paribas and our kind of colleagues across the room, we see the gap is really in the implementation of the principles or all the guidance that we've put together. But the guidance is really clear, and if you want to look even, so I mentioned the KPI registry, when it comes to ambition on the target, there is a very helpful document as well on the ICMA website that has been developed last year, actually, that lists the methodologies that you can use when you want to refer to benchmarks for a given type of KPI. So that also helps with defining ambition. And finally, I would say probably the biggest area of development in the market, you referred, Isabelle, to GHG emission KPI, so greenhouse gas emissions KPI, that are in reality, if you look broadly, there are not too many sectors that could avoid having a GHG emission KPI in SLB. Why? Because, decarbonization, the minister touched upon it as well, will be, one of the key elements we really need to tackle first and foremost. Not the only one, but we can't do without that. And in here, the crux of the market, and we've talked about it at length, and that will be the discussion for a long time ahead, is what do we do with scope 3, which is effectively everything that is beyond the direct control of a given company, a given entity. And this, again, we do refer to it quite clearly this year as well in the Climate Transition Finance Handbook. So the guidance is there. The implementation is not always as straightforward as the theory, and I think there's been a lot of progress, and we need more, definitely.
Thank you. Now coming to Angela, Isabelle, did you want to jump in before we... Angela hasn't been able to speak yet.
I just wanted to say that one of the things that perhaps one should welcome, rather than recoil in horror when we see, is when KPIs are missed.
Right.
So, the level of ambition will only be assumed if they're reaching targets. And when we've seen a lot of noise around a KPI being missed, actually it was as though the market was not doing its thing. Whereas to my mind, it is doing its thing when we start to see things being missed. So I think that is important to look out for things, and where issuers then explain why they have missed something. I think it again speaks to a stretching level of ambition that we need for this market, rather than easy to achieve targets or almost there already at the point that they're set.
Yeah, so actually if we have penalties, if we have fail, that's a good thing, because that shows we're being ambitious. I think that's a super important point. Angela, over to you. There's a number of other things that we've been doing. Can you fill us in?
I think it's pretty clear from the speeches we have heard today that the SLB and the transition are really the hot topics. The SLB is still a fairly new product, and the transition discussion is ongoing. That's where we have most of the focus. But of course we have done some additional work as well. But I think it's fair to say that the work we have done has been really much more about clarifying, updating, etc., already existing documents. And perhaps that's also a signal that, for example, the green and social bond, these are already fairly mature products, so maybe we don't need every year very detailed, updated guidelines for these products. And well, many of the questions, the topics that have been raised, we have actually been able to tackle in the Q&A handbook. And just a small reminder for those who don't know, the Q&A handbook. It's a supportive document to the principles where we give out more detailed and practical guidance for the sustainable bonds. But some of the work we have done this year, we have the social bond working group. They did clarify the language, confirming the need to identify target population. That has been done in the social bond principles. It's a topic we have been discussing for quite many years, and it has now finally been clarified. They have also added a Q&A on how to treat the general population, and also in order to raise awareness still about the social bonds, they have arranged for podcasts on target population with focus on gender and racial equity. The Green Bond Impact Reporting Working Group, which has been functioning for many, many years, has once again reviewed and also published new additional guidance on the core recommendations for impact reporting, and also updated the metrics for renewable energy and energy efficiency. And all of these are to be found in the harmonized framework on impact reporting for green bonds. It was mentioned already earlier that the references to just transitions, it has now been included both in the climate transition finance handbook, but also into the issuer pre-issuance checklists and information templates done by the issuers. So when we, for example, talk about climate transition, there may, of course, be both positive and negative impacts on workers, communities, and the surrounding environment. And hence we are encouraging the issuers to outline how they have considered these in their climate transition strategy. We have also revised some of the existing documents, like the high-level mapping to SDG. We have updated the issuer information template and external review forms, and also updated the Q&As on securitized bonds. And all these revised documents you can find on the Secretariat's, ICMA's homepage. So we encourage you to all have a look at those, and obviously welcome the feedback. The work in the principles will for sure continue straight after this conference, so there is more to do. But maybe if we elaborate a little bit more of some of the topics mentioned, then I would actually turn back to Isabelle, because as I mentioned, the work with the impact reporting has been going on for years, and I'm just wondering, would you like to summarize the work, the harmonized framework, the core recommendations, and perhaps reflect on whether we are done now, or is there a further need to still development the impact metrics, the core recommendations?
Thank you. So we have 10 eligible project categories in the Green Bond Principles. It's a non-exhaustive list, so it's not impossible to do other things. And so the renewable energy and energy efficiency had been the start, and it was borrowed from an MDB harmonized framework for that, Multilateral Development Bank framework. And subsequently, we started with water and wastewater, and then we continued through all 10. And we finished the last of the 10 categories the previous year. And so this year, we looked at two things. One was going back to the first category and trying to make it in line with all the other ones that we've done. So there's an introductory element which tries to explain what is meant by renewable energy and energy efficiency. There's a qualitative aspect that we always try and put into the chapters. So trying to highlight the areas that may be of concern. So for instance, in renewable energy, if you talk of, for instance, crop growing for renewable sources of energy that may take over from food security, that of course would be of a level of concern. So it just tries to contextualize which kinds of projects are positive and which ones may be of concern, and one would need to highlight mitigants. And then it tries to give core indicators, and those are substantially unchanged from the ones that we have before, and some other sustainability indicators, which include ones that are about outputs, outcomes, rather than impacts per se, and which may highlight some social issues, such as the just transition issue. So where you're doing a project that's focused on, for instance, renewable energy, and where you're looking at the overall decarbonization strategy and moving away from something where you need to focus on worker training and other aspects, new jobs. So that we did this year, but we also ran through all the other categories looking at what was being reported on existingly in people's green bond frameworks. And we were lucky that we had the Luxembourg Stock Exchange, the Climate Bond Initiative, and the Inter-American Development Bank providing some details of what they were seeing as being used for reporting. And the encouraging thing was that almost all issuers of green bonds and other use of proceeds bonds were indeed reporting on impacts or outputs or outcomes. But the substantial reporting appeared to be done in outputs and outcomes, except in relation to renewable energy and energy efficiency, where greenhouse gas reductions was, of course, prevalent across almost all issuers. But in all other categories, whilst there were a large number of impact metrics that were being used, actually the majority of issuers were still focused on what might be considered more output or outcome, so the number of users of water, wastewater, the number of collections for waste management, the number of companies, the amount of investment, rather than specific impact metrics that are suggested. And I think that perhaps over the coming year, one of the things that we may need to focus more on is helping issuers to transition from those output or outcome towards impact metrics. So what are the additional bits of information that they need to try and turn the number of outputs or outcomes into proper core impact metric reporting? And that, I think, may be the work without wishing to prejudge. So in all the working groups, we have significant number of members. And in the impact reporting, it's no exception. There are over 120 different issuers, investors, pressure groups, academic institutions and the like, as well as underwriters and rating agencies and others that are making suggestions. And so we, every year, work on what should we focus on in the coming year. And we will highlight the research that we did over this year in the use of the metrics to see whether they also think that that will be an important part of the work of the impact reporting working group in the coming year. But there may be additional topics, whether it's geographic specific, but we always try and look at things from a global perspective, making sure that all parts of the globe are taken into account and all sectors. So I think that's going to be the important change, perhaps, in the coming year.
Still more work to be done. Agnes, did you want to comment on any of the other topics we have worked on this year?
Maybe briefly, and then if you want to open up to question, but effectively, so we've noted all the kind of direct working groups that fall under the principles. It's important to note that there are joint working groups within the broader ICMA areas that the principles are involved in, and in particular on sustainable repo and sustainable commercial paper. And that's kind of more ongoing work. And then there is also a lot of collaboration, obviously, across market association. And for example, the latest to date was it's a fairly short document, but that triggered a lot of discussion, specifically with the high yield issuers and practical, effectively, recommendation when it comes to sustainability-linked bonds and how to apply it to the high yield market. So. So beyond effectively the direct working group and the principles development, there is a lot more going on that many of you are involved in already.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And it's important to underline that indeed the scope of the work that we're doing, sustainability, isn't just about sustainable bonds now. We mentioned sustainable repo. We've actually published commercial paper. We've actually pretty much finished the work, but we haven't published yet, and this is, it's really interesting to bring other segments of the debt markets into the conversation and bring the expertise that we have. Now, we've come into the last 10 minutes. This is the opportunity for Q&A. So first, in the room, please don't hesitate now to raise your hand. You've got a bit more time to think about your questions. There are microphones that I think are available for people to come to you. I think they're getting ready. So if we can prepare the microphones, the roving microphones. We have received a question already online, and this is for you, Agnes. The question is with respect to reporting on KPIs for sovereigns, and why would that be more difficult than for corporates? The question is they don't understand why that might be the case.
Yeah, so it's, and if there are any members kind of sovereign community, I'm very happy to pass the mic as well, but it's effectively the sheer volume of data that needs to be built up at the country level to result in the overall country GHG emission. And you can look into the future and think that, the world will be revolutionized by all the kind of development in technologies, and maybe we'll kind of get there. But it's true that at least the existing transactions do show that on an annual basis, in particular when it comes to GHG emission KPI, just by the breadth of information that needs to be collated, it can be impractical. You could think of other KPIs where it might be easier to report annually, even at sovereign level. But maybe we need to clarify, the target is really, and that remains in the principles, and that's true for any other issue than sovereigns, is to have an annual reporting of the KPI. So it was just to build in a minimum of flexibility so that it doesn't prevent sovereigns to come to the market, and in particular to include very important KPIs such as GHG emission.
Thank you very much. And yes, now, are there questions in the room? It's just you raise your hand and someone will run over with a microphone. Yes, on the left.
Hi, good morning. First and foremost, thank you very much for a very enlightening conversation. My name is Sachin Iyer. I'm from Citigroup's Sustainable DCM team. First of all, I wanted to congratulate the working group on the inclusion of just transition in the CTFH this time. I did want to ask, though, going forward, do you envisage further fleshing out the definition of what constitutes just transition?
Who would like to take that?
I think that we haven't provided a definition at this point, and in the Q&A, we intend to highlight the different references within the principles now. So we've got it in the CTFH handbook, as mentioned. We also have it in impact reporting, in social bonds, looking at both it from a positive perspective, so what projects might be deemed positive for just transition, but also the areas of concern and where we need to see mitigants. We may also reference various definitions that pre-exist, but landing on any one definition doesn't appear to make sense when there are out there several definitions, whether it's from World Bank, various different organizations, and others. So we may highlight other definitions that pre-exist rather than defining our own, but giving pointers to how we embed it within the principles already gives you the focus on what the areas of concern are, I think to a sufficient extent that we probably don't need to land on any one definition.
Perfect, thank you.
Are there other questions from the room? Please be brave. I've actually, I've got one for and nobody's raising their hand? Ah, there is a question. Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Han Ling from Bank of America Sustainable Banking Solution Group, APAC. Thank you for choosing Singapore for the 9th annual conference. Because APAC actually sits in different energy mix, as you can imagine. Transition finance is very meaningful. So my question will be, how do we make sure to take the reality of APAC into consideration when contemplating the, integrality of the transition finance? Thank you.
Maybe I can have a first go on this. And that's a very good question, and it's a preoccupation of ours. The first thing is, as you know, at ICMA we have very solid presence now in APAC, led by my colleague Mushtaq Kapasi from Hong Kong, but he spends a lot of time in Singapore too, and I expect going forward increasing time. And one of the preoccupations we have is making sure that whether it's from a market perspective or a regulatory perspective, we fully understand what's happening in APAC. And before this conference, we actually had 2 roundtables, one focused on taxonomies and one specifically on transition, to your point, on transition finance. And quite frankly, it's really illuminating for us to hear the perspective. One, from a regulatory perspective, I think that APAC has benefited from the first wave of work on taxonomies, and what we're seeing now in this part of the world is taxonomy 2.0. And what I think is really interesting, taxonomy 2.0, and Minister Indrani referred to this with respect to the Singapore taxonomy, is we're seeing explicit integration of transition. And if there's one key feedback that we have from the experience in other jurisdictions, I'm thinking particularly, of course, of the EU, but not only, is that they tended to be too static and binary. And so, really, it's important to look at the work in this part of the world, because these taxonomies that are coming out, in Singapore, in ASEAN, but also in Japan, are ones which are better, quite frankly, at dealing with transition. And then from a market perspective, it's really important for us to hear different perspectives. When you talk about transition in the EU, or even in North America, it's very different from what's meant here. And it's really important that we have these conversations so that we can agree on what we can agree on, but also disagree. And there are areas where, quite frankly, and this came up in some of our discussions yesterday, areas where we disagree, and that's fine. Let's have those conversations. Let's disagree, but let's move forward based on having those those interactions.
Maybe a quick point on that. I would totally agree with you, Nicola, in the sense that when the Minister was explaining the status of the Singaporean taxonomy with the traffic light system, the EU has kind of started that work, but it hasn't moved as fast as the Singaporean taxonomy, for example, in terms of development. So I would say it's a good thing in reality that this is maybe more advanced even in Asia than in Europe, and it can be tailored really to the local context. And at least the work that is done at the principles level is meant to remain fairly neutral, so it can accommodate effectively all this. And it is evolutive. Yeah, that's probably as well. We don't have as much, I would say, the question around the regulation topic here in Asia as we get it very often in Europe. But the big difference of the principles is that it can keep evolving as the market effectively requires, a lot better than any regulatory framework. And so that's always the spirit of supporting and framing the development rather than preempting it, I would say.
Now, I think with that, we're going to have to close. We started a bit late, but I think we're finishing bang on time. So let me thank with you our great panel, and we're going to move on to our next keynote speaker, who's going to be introduced by Brian.